Mornings were the only time I could walk without the weight of the world pressing on my shoulders. The city outside stirred in its usual rhythm, unaware of the quiet calculations and silent debts carried by people like me. I preferred it that way, routine, predictable, controlled. My home was orderly, precise, the kind of place where nothing was left to chance. Every gesture, every movement had a purpose. Even the grief I carried for my daughter had a measured place in my life. I visited her room each morning. Her favorite books still lay on the shelves, the soft toys she once cherished neatly arranged on the bed. I spoke to her quietly, not expecting an answer. No one knew I did this. My men thought I was ruthless, unyielding, a man defined by power and fear. But beneath that, I held a fragment of tenderness, one carefully guarded fragment that belonged only to her. Work followed with its own cadence. Meetings, decisions, transactions, the machinery of influence and control spun around me. My associates treated me with deference, sometimes bordering on fear. I allowed it. I needed it. In this world, strength was the only language anyone respected. And yet, even in those corridors of authority, I noticed the little things. A glance too long, a hesitation before speaking, the flicker of uncertainty behind eyes that were supposed to be loyal. I dismissed them. I had to. Trust was a fragile luxury, and I had built my life on the careful assumption that loyalty could be bought or broken. Evenings were quieter. I walked alone to the small chapel near the edge of the property, lit a candle, and spoke to her in silence. I remembered her laugh, the way she used to chase the sunlight across the yard, the tiny hands that clutched mine. These memories were mine to keep, private, untouchable. Sometimes I allowed myself a small smile, even in grief, even in the constant shadow of my choices. I trusted very few people. My right-hand men, my inner circle, they were tested constantly. I observed them as much as they observed me. Loyalty in this life was a performance, often practiced more convincingly than truth. Yet, even in my measured life, in my calculated control, I felt something I could not name, an unease that the world, my world, might be less certain than I had convinced myself it was. And then there were strangers, the little ones, the innocents, the ones who could disrupt everything without even knowing it. I had always believed that as long as I maintained vigilance, as long as I controlled the perimeter of my life, I could protect what mattered most. My daughter's memory was one of those rare things I could not allow to be touched. It was sacred. But even sacred things are not always safe. Even in control, even in trust, the smallest fracture can grow unseen until it becomes impossible to ignore. I noticed it first in small, almost imperceptible ways. A misplaced file on my desk, a door left slightly ajar, the faint echo of voices that stopped when I entered a room. Nothing concrete, nothing that demanded attention, just a whisper of wrongness that brushed against the edges of my awareness. I told myself it was fatigue, the consequence of years spent balancing control and vigilance, the inevitable cracks that appear in any carefully maintained structure. Still, the unease persisted. My men, usually precise and disciplined, began showing subtle signs of distraction. A glance that lingered too long, a hesitation before answering, a question posed and then immediately retracted. I watched, studied, measured. None of it was outright betrayal. None of it warranted confrontation. But it unsettled me because I could feel the tension in the air, like electricity before a storm. Even at home, the quiet sanctuary I had built for myself, I sensed the shift. A note left carelessly on the kitchen counter, a vase slightly askew, the faint smell of cigarette smoke in the air, though no one had permission to light one inside. These were details, almost trivial, but my mind cataloged them with the precision of a ledger. Every anomaly demanded attention, and yet I could not yet name the threat. I told myself to wait, to watch, to measure. Patience was a weapon I had mastered long ago. I found myself double-checking routines I had performed 1,000 times. The locks on the gates, the inventory in the office, the schedules of those closest to me. Everything was accounted for, and yet a niggling doubt had taken root, a shadow that moved at the corner of my consciousness. It was a discomfort that had no face, no voice, only the faint tremor of a question I could not answer. What am I missing? Even the world outside reflected it. The city seemed sharper, more dangerous. Drivers hesitated too long at intersections, pedestrians' eyes lingered in ways they never had before. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt altered. I found myself walking slower, listening more closely, observing details I had once ignored. My instincts, honed over decades of command and calculation, screamed caution, and I obeyed them without complaint. At night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day in fragments. Nothing overt, nothing that could be called a mistake, yet a sense of fragility had settled over my carefully constructed life. It was subtle, almost invisible, but I felt it pressing against me, insinuating itself into my thoughts. I knew better than to dismiss it entirely. Even the smallest crack can widen if left unattended, and I had learned that every disruption, no matter how minor, could have consequences I might not survive. For now, I did nothing. I watched. I measured. I waited. The discomfort was there, growing in quiet increments, a signal I could not yet interpret. It was enough to unsettle me, enough to awaken the first flicker of suspicion, the first tremor of something that could not be ignored for long. The first unmistakable sign came in the way people avoided my eyes. My inner circle, the ones I had trusted for years, began hesitating when I asked simple questions. A ledger entry missing, a meeting rescheduled at the last minute, a name mentioned incorrectly, small errors, trivial on the surface, but each one carried weight I could not ignore. I confronted no one immediately. I had learned the value of patience, the way a predator watches before striking. But every interaction felt different now. Smiles seemed forced, nods too deliberate. Even the men I had counted on as loyal seemed to hesitate, as if weighing their words against some unseen truth. I had built my life on reading people, on noticing the subtle shift in posture, the fleeting twitch of an eye. And these moments, fleeting though they were, told me something was amiss. At home, the cracks became harder to ignore. A drawer I never used left slightly open, a message on my phone erased before I could read it, the faint smell of perfume, not familiar, not hers, lingering in the hall. I found myself checking the rooms I thought were private, listening at doors, scrutinizing every interaction for signs of deception. My instincts had never failed me, and they were screaming now. I started keeping records. Notes on what was said when it was said, the inconsistencies that gnawed at the edges of my mind. They were small, almost insignificant individually, but together they formed a pattern I could no longer dismiss. I began to see the threads linking behavior, the half-truths and contradictions that hinted at a deliberate hiding of facts. Even the world outside began reflecting these anomalies. People who should have been predictable made unpredictable choices, drivers suddenly swerving without cause, guards misplacing keys, associates miscommunicating. The ordinary, mundane rhythm of my life had begun to falter, and it left me unsettled. I could feel it in my chest, a pressure I could neither name nor release. Suspicion, like a slow poison, spread through my thoughts. I had always known betrayal was possible, even probable, but I had never expected it to creep in so quietly, so subtly, into the places I had deemed most secure. My daughter's memory, the sanctum of my heart, felt vulnerable now, not physically, but emotionally, spiritually. Even the fortress I had built around my life was not immune. And yet, no one had openly lied to me. No one had directly crossed a line. The danger was in what was unspoken, in the small omissions, the evasions, the subtle shifts that suggested there was more beneath the surface than anyone would admit. It was a first red flag, small but bright, a warning signal that the ground beneath me was not as solid as I had believed. I did not act. I observed, I noted, I waited. But now, with every passing day, the sense of unease had sharpened into suspicion. The pieces were beginning to move, and I could almost hear the quiet whisper of a truth I was not yet ready to confront. I tried to speak up, cautiously at first. Questions, small and precise, meant to clarify the oddities I had been noticing. But the answers I received were carefully rehearsed, calm and dismissive. "You're imagining things," one said, almost gently. Another smiled, patronizing, and added, "Stress plays tricks on everyone. You've been pushing too hard." Their words were soft, but each one cut deeper than a blade, undermining the certainty I relied on. The tension in my chest grew heavier. I had always controlled my surroundings, maintained dominance over those around me. Yet when I voiced concern, I found myself being questioned instead. My instincts, my experience, my understanding of the world, all subtly questioned as if my judgment were faulty. The manipulation was quiet, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but I felt its weight acutely. It wasn't just words. Actions, too, seemed designed to unsettle me. Documents misplaced only to reappear later, meetings forgotten, until I reminded them, details altered just enough to make me doubt my memory. I began to second-guess myself in moments I had once been unshakable. The subtlety of it was terrifying. Nothing blatant, nothing illegal, nothing that could be used as evidence, only a creeping erosion of certainty. I started noticing the expressions, the faint smirk as I repeated my concerns, the quick exchange of glances when I wasn't looking, the polite nods that carried a hidden weight of mockery. The people I had trusted, the men I had relied on for years, had learned to speak around me, not to me. Every attempt to probe deeper was met with careful deflection, a precision designed to make me question not them, but myself. Even at home, the small disturbances continued. A chair slightly out of place, a note misplaced and then returned, the feeling that I was being watched. It was as if the world I had built for security, for clarity, was now subtly rearranged to make me doubt my own senses. The sanctuary I had constructed around my daughter's memory, my private moments of grief, seemed no longer immune. I tried silence at first, observation without comment, but the isolation it brought was suffocating. The more I withheld, the more the quiet manipulation continued. I began to feel the familiar weight of being underestimated, the power imbalance becoming painfully clear. I had command in every visible way, yet those closest to me had found a place where my authority faltered, a space they could exploit without fear of consequence. By the end of the week, I realized I was walking on a path I had not chosen, guided by others, intent rather than my own. Each small dismissal, each gentle suggestion that I was overreacting, was a thread in a tapestry I did not want to see but could not ignore. The doubt planted by others had begun to bloom within me, subtle but insistent, a quiet erosion of the foundation I had spent my life building. I was still watching, still calculating, still holding on to the pieces I knew were true. But now, with each passing day, I felt the pressure mounting, the quiet undermining of my certainty, and the realization that some truths, no matter how carefully hidden, would eventually demand recognition. It began with a slip, a detail spoken too quickly, a hesitation I had learned to notice over decades of observing people. I had been reviewing the ledger as I always did, when I caught it, a number that didn't match, a transaction recorded differently than it should have been. Small, almost insignificant, but my instincts flared immediately. Someone had left a trace. I started paying closer attention, retracing steps, listening more intently to conversations I had previously ignored. A word here, a pause there, and suddenly the pattern became clear. There was an undercurrent of deception flowing through the routines I thought were solid. A witness, one of the low-ranking men I rarely spoke to, mentioned a meeting I had never authorized. A name dropped in passing, almost accidentally, resonated like an alarm bell in my mind. Even at home, I began noticing subtle signs. A piece of mail I didn't expect, a voice on the phone that sounded almost like hers, a small token placed where it shouldn't have been. Nothing overt, nothing that could be pinned definitively on anyone, but enough to make me pause, enough to make me realize the deception I had been feeling for weeks was not imagined. I started to gather evidence quietly. Notes, recordings, photographs, fragments of a reality I had been too cautious to face directly. Each piece alone was incomplete, but together they formed a mosaic I could not ignore. It wasn't a full picture yet, but the edges were beginning to reveal themselves, the outlines of a truth someone had tried to bury. I noticed a shift in behavior, too. The people who had been dismissive, mocking, now became careful. Words chosen with precision, eyes darting to others before meeting mine, small gestures that hinted at awareness they had been caught, even partially. They knew I was seeing. They knew I had begun to understand. The realization was slow, like a tide creeping over sand. I had suspected, I had watched, I had waited, but now I could feel the weight of reality pressing in. The partial exposure was enough to make the world I had thought secure feel fragile. I could sense the vulnerability of my daughter's memory, my private sanctuary, and even the walls I had built around my empire seemed less formidable. I did not confront anyone, not yet. That would come later, if at all. For now, observation was enough. I had learned to let people reveal themselves through their own actions, and now the truth was seeping out of the smallest cracks. Witnesses, forgotten notes, unintended confessions, they were all giving me pieces of a puzzle I had refused to acknowledge. And with each new piece, the unease I had been carrying for weeks solidified into certainty. Betrayal was real. It existed, and it was close, threaded through the lives I thought I understood. The quiet exposure was cruel in its restraint, revealing just enough to make me aware of the danger, but never enough to let me grasp it fully. I realized then that once truth begins to surface, it cannot be stopped. The fragments of reality, however small, demand recognition. And recognition, in my world, changes everything. The cracks I had been monitoring widened quickly, almost imperceptibly at first, then with a force I could no longer ignore. What had been subtle, the half-truths, the evasions, the omissions, became bold. People who once whispered behind my back now acted as though I were blind. Meetings were rescheduled without explanation, promises made and broken, information withheld in ways that could no longer be dismissed as mistakes. The systems I had built to maintain control began to falter under the weight of deliberate action. I confronted no one directly. That would have been premature, reckless even. Instead, I observed the patterns, watched the ripple effects, and measured the consequences of every misstep. The men who had seemed loyal now revealed fractures I had never suspected. Their subtle manipulations were no longer hidden. They were precise, intentional, and increasingly reckless. Even at home, the escalation was impossible to ignore. Notes that should have been confidential appeared in places where others could see them. Calls I expected to be private were interrupted by someone else's voice in the background. The sense of sanctuary I had once maintained for my daughter's memory began to erode, replaced by a quiet but persistent intrusion. It was as if the betrayal had decided to occupy every corner of my life, leaving no space untouched. And then came the confrontations I had been avoiding. A trusted lieutenant misled me during a discussion about finances. Another associate openly contradicted my instructions, claiming a different plan had already been executed. Every lie, every deliberate misdirection, pushed me closer to the realization that my control was slipping. The danger was no longer hypothetical. It had moved from subtle signals to tangible consequences. A shipment mishandled, a contact lost, a plan undermined, all indicators that someone within my inner circle was not merely hiding information, but actively working against me. The betrayal was no longer an abstraction. It was a force pressing directly against the foundation I had built over decades. I felt the familiar weight of responsibility, the pressure of authority, but now it carried a new tension, the need to respond, to anticipate, to protect what was left from being destroyed. My instincts screamed caution, but the patterns were clear. If I did not act decisively, the damage would extend far beyond control, touching everything I held dear. The escalation was relentless. Each day brought a new confirmation that the quiet manipulations were part of a larger design. The world I had maintained through precision and observation was under siege, and those who had been dismissed as loyal were proving themselves capable of undermining everything I had spent a lifetime securing. And amidst it all, I felt the fragility of my own heart. The memory of my daughter, the sacred space I had preserved, felt threatened not by violence but by deception, by the knowledge that betrayal had penetrated deeper than I had allowed myself to fear. The stakes had risen. The game had changed, and I had no choice but to face it. It hit me quietly in a way that left no room for denial. The evidence, the fragments, the patterns I had been piecing together, they were all real. I had suspected, watched, waited, but suspicion is a shadow compared to certainty. I saw it clearly now. Loyalty had been a mask, trust a performance, and the truth was that I had been deceived by those I had considered unbreakable. I felt a hollow ache deep in my chest, the kind that no wealth, no influence, no authority could touch. My mind replayed every interaction, every hesitation, every slight smile that had seemed innocent at the time. They were not innocent. They had been rehearsed, deliberate, and aimed to erode me quietly, to undermine the world I had built. The weight of it pressed down with a force I could not deflect. I thought of my daughter, the fragment of my life I had always guarded. Her memory, once a sanctuary, now felt vulnerable. The betrayal was not abstract. It was intimate, creeping into the spaces I had believed untouchable. I had imagined that control could protect what mattered, that vigilance was enough to shield the people and moments I cherished. I was wrong. The emotional breaking point was not dramatic. There was no screaming, no shattering of objects. It was the quiet collapse of certainty, the slow erosion of the inner fortress I had maintained. I sat alone in the study, staring at the walls that had witnessed decades of command, of calculated authority, of precision. They offered no comfort. Even the familiar smell of leather and paper, the symbols of power and stability, could not shield me from the truth. I realized how much I had underestimated the subtlety of deception. It was never about force. It was about quiet, patient manipulation. The small omissions, the deflections, the half-truths, they had accumulated until the structure of my life trembled under the weight of what I had refused to see. I had spent years honing instinct and observation, yet even I had been caught unprepared by the slow, persistent erosion of loyalty. I felt grief, sharp and unrelenting, but it was entwined with something heavier, the awareness of my own vulnerability. For decades, I had measured the world in terms of power, influence, fear, and control. Now I understood that power could be subverted not with confrontation, but with patience, subtlety, and the exploitation of trust. And in that quiet, unguarded moment, I understood the true cost. It was not loss of control, not financial damage, not even the risk to reputation. It was the shattering of certainty, the realization that even the most sacred spaces, memories, relationships, the fragments of love we cling to are not immune. I sat in silence, the echo of betrayal ringing in every corner of my mind. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of it, to confront the emptiness left in the absence of what I thought was unbreakable. And as I did, I knew something irrevocable had shifted. The truth I had been piecing together could no longer be ignored. Every half-truth, every misdirection, every subtle lie had led to this moment. The betrayal was no longer hidden. Those who had thought they could manipulate, deceive, or evade accountability were now exposed in quiet, undeniable ways. I did not shout. I did not storm the halls. The consequences were slow, precise, and unavoidable, like gravity settling on a structure already weakened. I watched as patterns I had tolerated for weeks collapsed under their own weight. A lieutenant who had been evasive was caught in a contradiction he could not explain. A trusted associate, who had whispered assurances behind closed doors, faltered when asked to account for actions he had carefully concealed. Every deception surfaced, quietly but relentlessly, leaving no room for denial. The fallout extended beyond the individuals involved. Systems I had built, networks I had maintained, began to strain under the sudden clarity. Deals previously assumed secure now required reassessment. Alliances once dependable now demanded scrutiny. The world I had controlled, so carefully curated, revealed cracks I could not repair instantly. But unlike before, these cracks were no longer subtle. They were evidence, and the evidence spoke louder than words or threats ever could. Even at home, the consequences were personal. The quiet space I had preserved for my daughter's memory felt irrevocably touched. The betrayal had penetrated places I thought sacred, leaving traces that could not be erased. It was a silent, heavy reminder that deception, once allowed to grow, spares no one, not even the parts of our lives we guard most fiercely. I did not seek revenge. That was not the point. The consequences were not about punishment or spectacle. They were about recognition, accountability, and the immutable truth that actions carry weight, whether acknowledged or not. The betrayers faced the reality of exposure in the same measured, quiet way that they had constructed their lies. There were no grand confessions, no dramatic confrontations, just the steady, inescapable reckoning that comes when deception is revealed and can no longer be concealed. I felt a strange clarity in the aftermath. The world remained harsh, and the people around me imperfect, but the uncertainty, the doubt that had shadowed every interaction for weeks had lifted. There was no joy in it, no satisfaction, just understanding. Just the knowledge that what had been hidden was now visible, and that visibility could not be undone. And in that knowledge, I understood the full measure of what had been lost and what remained. My daughter's memory, my private moments of devotion, the fragments of life I had believed untouchable, those could not be taken, could not be corrupted. Everything else was now subject to consequence, and consequence had arrived with quiet, relentless precision. The world did not shift dramatically after the truth emerged. There were no explosions, no confrontations, no triumphant speeches. The consequences had already done their work quietly, almost imperceptibly, leaving only the weight of what had been revealed. The people who had betrayed me were still present, but their power had diminished, their influence quietly eroded. The deception had unraveled without fanfare, and life, in its relentless rhythm, continued. I returned to the cemetery as I had countless times before. The marble gravestone gleamed faintly under the soft morning light. The little girl I had seen that day was gone, leaving behind only the memory of her words, fragile and piercing. I stood there, alone, feeling the emptiness of both absence and understanding. Her presence had shattered the illusion of control I had maintained, revealing vulnerabilities I had never admitted, not even to myself. The grief for my daughter mingled with something heavier now, the knowledge that even my carefully guarded life could not prevent the intrusion of truth, of loss, of betrayal. I lit a candle and placed it gently on the stone, its flame steady, fragile, and fleeting. I said nothing. There was no prayer, no plea, only the quiet acknowledgement of what was, what had been, and what could never be restored. At home, the silence was different. The routines remained, the walls stood, the rooms retained their order, but I moved through them with a sense of distance. I had learned the cost of misplaced trust, the fragility of control, the quiet cruelty of deception. Yet I also understood that some things endure, however quietly, however imperfectly. The memory of love, the fragments of devotion, the truths we cannot erase, they remain even in the face of betrayal. I did not seek revenge. There was nothing to gain. The world, for all its complexity, had imposed its own reckoning, and in the stillness I finally accepted it. Life continued, not as I had imagined, not as I had controlled it, but with a clarity I had long avoided. The lessons were harsh but enduring. The weight remained, heavy and unyielding, yet undeniable. And so I stood there a while longer, breathing, observing, and allowing the truth to settle. Quietly, painfully, irrevocably.